Engineer mocks a black bricklayer without knowing who he really is. Can you step aside and let the rail professionals handle this? Richard's sharp voice sliced through the noise of construction site's meeting area. His words made the whole room fall silent. We don't pay bricklayers to think, just to follow directions. Andre Jefferson felt a wave of heat climb up his neck as dozens of eyes turned toward him. At 42, with 20 years of hard-earned experience in construction, he had never been shamed like this in front of so many people. His only mistake had been pointing out a dangerous flaw in the foundation design, one that had threatened the stability of the entire 30-story corporate tower. With respect, sir, Andre answered steadily, his voice calm despite the sting of humiliation. The slope of this land will push uneven weight onto the northeast foundations. The numbers don't take that into account. But Richard cut him off with a loud, mocking laugh, spinning toward a group of engineers and managers. Listen up, everyone. Our bricklayer here now claims to understand structural calculations. Maybe we should hand him a degree, since clearly he knows more than someone with a master's from Stanford. Nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Andre stared straight ahead, forcing his breath steady, trying to tame the anger burning inside. This wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice, but being insulted publicly struck a deeper wound. Richard Harrington, the newly hired chief engineer at Horizon Constructions, had been on the job barely 3 months. Already, he had a reputation for arrogance and a hot temper. His polished blazer and Italian shoes made him stand out sharply from the workers in dusty overalls and callous hands. Men he looked down on daily. If you want to keep your job, Richard sneered, stepping closer to Andre with a cold smile, then stick to mixing cement and leave the real decisions to the educated. The room froze in tense silence. Some workers stared at the floor in shame, while a few white engineers smirked at the humiliation. But none of them noticed the calm in Andre's eyes. It wasn't the look of a man giving in. It was the steady gaze of someone watching his opponent walk straight into a trap. Understood, sir, Andre replied simply, gathering his notes. I only thought it was worth mentioning. Richard grinned, pleased with himself. Good. Now that we've settled the chain of command, let's move on. We're on a tight schedule. The meeting continued with Richard taking control, showing charts on his tablet, explaining changes that would save both money and time. No one noticed Andre quietly tapping out a message on his old cell phone. When the meeting wrapped up, workers began to scatter, only for Richard's phone to buzz with notification. His expression shifted as he read it. Emergency meeting with the owner in 15 minutes, he announced tensely. Apparently, Thomas Jefferson is coming to check progress himself. A ripple of surprise swept the room. Thomas Jefferson, the elusive owner of Horizon Constructions, was rarely seen at any site. His presence always meant something serious. Richard adjusted his tie nervously, trying to mask his unease. Get this place spotless immediately, he barked. Workers rushed to comply, while no one noticed Andre quietly slipping away toward the administrative trailer. Behind his modest work clothes was a truth no one here suspected, a truth about to turn Richard Harrington's world upside down. If this story of prejudice hidden beneath professionalism stirs your anger, stay tuned, because what came next would turn Andre's humiliation into a powerful reminder. Never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book just might be your boss. 15 minutes turned into a tense hour. Inside the trailer, Richard paced nervously, checking his watch again and again, while the other engineers fumbled with blueprints they had already memorized. Nobody dared mention the obvious. Thomas Jefferson never made unplanned visits, and when he did, it was rarely for good news. Is this about the budget cuts I approved? Richard whispered to his assistant. I told him we saved nearly $1 million on foundation materials. I don't know, sir, the assistant muttered, equally nervous. The message only said he wanted to evaluate the project personally. Outside, Andre walked calmly to a modest sedan parked far from the executive area. He opened the trunk, slipped off his dusty work shirt, and replaced it with a crisp, neatly ironed dress shirt. From the trunk, he also pulled out a sleek leather briefcase and thin-rimmed glasses. He's here, someone shouted as a shiny black Mercedes rolled into the site entrance. Instantly, The entire crew rushed to line up at attention. Richard adjusted his tie and hurried forward, forcing a polished smile onto his face as he extended his hand. Mr. Jefferson, what an honor. Everything is perfectly on schedule. The driver's door opened first, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped out. Clearly security. Then from the rear door came a middle-aged black man in a flawless suit, his face serious, lined with years of experience. Richard's confident smile faltered. His expression shifted from warmth to confusion. "I'm sorry, we're waiting for Mr. Thomas Jefferson," he said awkwardly. The man extended his hand. Thomas Andre Jefferson, owner of Horizon Constructions. Gasps rippled across the site. The stunned looks on everyone's faces would have been comical if they weren't so telling. Richard blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "But you're," he stammered, unable to finish the sentence. "Yes," Thomas replied coolly. "I am the owner, and I'm also the bricklayer you mocked in front of the entire crew just hours ago." A heavy silence settled over the site. Richard's face turned ghostly pale, nearly as white as the plaster on the unfinished walls behind him. "Mr. Jefferson, there must be some misunderstanding." When the engineers quickly stepped in, Mr. Harrington didn't realize I was the owner? Thomas finished firmly. "Exactly. No one knew, because I wanted it that way." He looked around at the workers, who had now gathered at a distance, watching with wide eyes. 15 years ago, I started Horizon Constructions with the dream of changing the way we build. But over time, I noticed we were losing touch with the ground level, the real work. That's why, with every major project, I begin undercover. I trade my suit for a mason's clothes and use my middle name. Richard swayed as if he might faint. "Mr. Jefferson, I had no idea. If I had known." "That's the problem." Thomas cut him off sharply, though his tone remained controlled. "If you had known who I was, you would have shown respect. But because you thought I was just another black laborer, you felt free to humiliate me." At that moment, an older man with dark skin and graying hair stepped forward. It was Walter Green, the master builder who had overseen Horizon's project for decades. "Mr. T," Walter said with a knowing smile, "you could have given me a heads up. You were running one of your hidden inspections again." Thomas smiled faintly, the first smile since stepping out of the car. "And spoil the truth of how things really work? You know that defeats the purpose." Walter nodded, then turned his eyes toward Richard with a look that mixed disappointment with a touch of satisfaction. "I've known Thomas for 30 years. We worked side by side as bricklayers before he built this company." Thomas added, adjusting the glasses on his face, a subtle but powerful shift from worker to executive. "I've always believed a building is only as strong as its weakest foundation, and a company is only as honest as its most arrogant employee." Several workers who had seen Andre, now revealed as Thomas, get mocked earlier exchanged smiles. Some whispered to one another, while others simply watched, their expression saying, "Now this will be interesting." Richard scrambled for recovery. "Mr. Jefferson, please, if you'll allow me to explain my vision for this project." "Your vision?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "The same vision that ignored a warning about dangerous flaws in the Northeast Foundation? The same vision that cut corners on safety to save money." He gestured to Walter, who stepped forward holding a folder. "I already asked Walter to review the issues I pointed out this morning. And guess what? We found microcracks forming exactly where I warned they would." Thomas turned to the team of engineers. His voice was steady but commanding. "I want everyone in the main trailer for a full meeting in 15 minutes. Bring every blueprint, cost sheet, and technical decision made over the last 3 months," Thomas ordered. The group hurried off, leaving him standing close to Richard. Dropping his voice so only Richard could hear, Thomas said, "Do you know the real irony, Mr. Harrington? If you had simply listened to the bricklayer, you would have impressed the owner of this company with your humility and teamwork. Instead, he left the thought hanging, adjusting the wristwatch hidden all morning beneath his worker's shirt." Richard stood frozen, pale and stiff as a statue. Thomas walked away toward the administrative trailer, trailed now by company executives rushing to keep up. In Richard's eyes, there was no trace of arrogance anymore. Only raw fear, the look of a man realizing that his own pride and prejudice had dug his downfall. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, stretching long shadows across the site, one truth stood firm. The humiliation Richard had planted earlier that morning was already growing fast, brick by brick, into a structure that would soon collapse on him completely. Inside Horizon's main trailer, silence reigned. On one side sat Richard Harrington and his pale, shaken team. On the other sat Thomas Jefferson, now in a sharp business suit, flanked by Walter and two auditors. "Let's get straight to it," Thomas began calmly. "Why were my warnings about the Foundation not only dismissed but mocked?" Richard cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Jefferson, this was all a misunderstanding. I was simply reinforcing the chain of hierarchy." Thomas interrupted, holding up his tablet. "Our company manual is clear. Any employee, regardless of rank, has the duty to report potential structural risks." With a swipe, he played an audio recording from the site. Richard's own voice echoed through the room. "We work with calculations here, not with the eye of a bricklayer who can't even use a tape measure properly." Richard tugged at his tie, suffocating under the weight of his own words. "In the last 2 hours," Thomas continued, projecting documents onto the wall, "we reviewed every one of your engineering choices." An auditor stood. "We found 17 safety violations. The most serious involves the Northeast Foundation. We also discovered unauthorized substitutions of materials and falsified test reports." Richard's face drained of color. "I can explain." One engineer suddenly broke under pressure. "Mr. Jefferson, some of us warned Mr. Harrington about these issues. He insisted the calculations were fine and said the cost cuts were necessary." "For what reason?" Thomas pressed. "For the project bonus." Another admitted quietly. "If we saved over $1 million, we'd all receive large payouts." Richard shot to his feet. "This is a setup? I'm a respected professional, a Stanford graduate. I won't be brought down by a group of..." "Of what?" Thomas cut in sharply. "Bricklayers? Black workers?" "Finish your thought." The silence that followed was crushing. Richard collapsed into his chair, defeated. Thomas signaled to Walter, who handed him a folder. Richard's trembling hands opened it. His termination letter. "I'm being fired?" he asked in disbelief. "You have 2 options," Thomas said evenly. "First, dismissal for cause, with civil proceedings for negligence and falsification. You'll lose your license. Second, voluntary resignation. In return, you will return all bonuses and serve 6 months as a volunteer in our training program for youth from disadvantaged communities. You have 5 minutes to decide. Meanwhile, let's gather everyone outside. They deserve to hear this." In the central courtyard, workers crowded curiously. Thomas stepped onto a platform. "Good afternoon. For those who don't know me, I'm Thomas Andre Jefferson, founder of Horizon Constructions. Some of you knew me as Andre, the new bricklayer." Surprised smiles spread across the group. "I'm here for 2 reasons," Thomas continued. "First, to announce that Richard Harrington is no longer part of this company." A stunned hush was quickly replaced by applause. Applause Thomas quieted with a raised hand. "Second, and more importantly, to remind you of what Horizon stands for. Here, we don't just build structures. We build respect. Whether you earned your degree in a classroom or through years of labor, your knowledge matters. Your voice deserves to be heard." The trailer door opened. Richard emerged, carrying a box of his belongings. His walk was slow, his shoulders hunched. Workers didn't laugh or jeer. They only stared with quiet pity, which cut deeper than mockery. As Richard reached his car, his eyes briefly met Thomas's. He gave a small nod, not of regret, but of a man who finally understood the gulf between holding authority and earning respect. Walter stepped up beside Thomas. Which option did he choose? Thomas gave a faint smile. Surprisingly, voluntary training. Even the hardest cases can change. Walter shook his head. You've always been able to see beyond appearances. That's why you built this company from the ground up, Walter said quietly. Thomas stood at the edge of the site, watching workers return to their tasks with fresh energy. Real architecture isn't just about raising walls, Walter. It's about tearing down the invisible ones, the barriers that silence people with talent and experience. On the horizon, steel and concrete climbed against the sky. But for Thomas, those buildings symbolized more than construction. They were monuments to a belief. Respect is never demanded by title. It is earned by the humility to recognize wisdom, even in the rough hands of those who know the very soil that holds a foundation, not just buildings, but a human dignity. 6 months later, Horizon's new tower stood tall on the city skyline. Its foundations reinforced exactly where Thomas had once warned of danger. On the 30th floor, in a conference room overlooking the city, Thomas chaired the quarterly meeting. Walter, now promoted to director of operations, presented results of the new worker integration program. Our safety ratings have improved by 78% since adopting open communication. Now, any employee, no matter their role, can raise concerns without fear. Problems get solved before they become disasters. Thomas nodded, pleased. What had begun as public humiliation for him, as Andre the bricklayer, had turned into a cultural revolution at Horizon. Other companies across the nation were now studying and copying the model. And the volunteer program? Thomas asked, though he already knew. Walter smiled as the next slide appeared. In the photo, a group of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds were being trained in construction. Among the instructors was Richard Harrington, thinner, unshaven, but with a changed look in his eyes. The program has already trained 52 youths, Walter explained. 94% now have stable jobs. As for our most unusual instructor, I admit he's exceeded my expectations. Later that day, Thomas visited the training center on the ground floor. There was Richard, no longer in tailored suits, but in rolled-up sleeves, teaching structural calculations to a diverse group of students. When he looked up and saw Thomas, something unspoken passed between them. Not friendship, but mutual respect. Later, in the parking lot, Thomas found Richard loading teaching materials into a modest car. Mr. Jefferson, Richard greeted formally. How are you adjusting? Thomas asked. Richard hesitated. At first, I thought it was punishment. 6 months teaching math to kids who barely finished high school. But he glanced at the building. They learn fast. They ask questions we never think of. They see solutions outside the books. It's amazing what we discover, Thomas replied gently, when we stop judging by appearances. Richard lowered his eyes. I learned that lesson on my first day. It wasn't punishment, was it? No, Thomas answered. It was transformation for them and for you. My term ends in 2 weeks, Richard said. I've received job offers already, but I've asked to stay another semester as a volunteer instructor. Some of my students show promise, and I don't want to leave them halfway. A quiet smile spread across Thomas's face. Approved. As he returned to his office, Thomas reflected on the unlikely journey. From bricklayer to business owner, he had built more than towers. He had built a legacy of dignity and respect, one that went beyond titles and prejudice. In the lobby of Horizon's headquarters, a new golden plaque carried the company's motto, born from that unforgettable day. We build with steel and concrete, but we build respect with humility. For Richard, engineering had once been about numbers and prestige, but life had taught him a deeper lesson. Every structure, no matter how tall, begins with solid foundation, and the same is true of character. The insult he once hurled at a mere bricklayer had destroyed his career. Yet from that ruin, something greater was built. The understanding that real knowledge isn't about diplomas on the wall, but about recognizing value where others only see difference. For Thomas, victory wasn't in destroying the man who humiliated him. It was in reshaping him into someone better. Proof that true leadership is not about authority, but about example. If this story made you reflect on how easily we misjudge others, subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge prejudice and reveal hidden truths. Because real triumph doesn't come from defeating enemies. It comes from turning them into allies and building a world where the strongest foundation of all is respect.